all of these are critical. So if you don't listen to a single other episode that I ever make, please listen to this one, 10 things that will change the trajectory of your career. But I didn't know enough about management to ensure that our team operated effectively. Now I fast forward, I like to think I'm a much better leader. There are still areas where I struggle. There's still things I don't like doing. But that skill has improved so much. But I've read 50 books on the topic. I've gone to 10 different leadership trainings, some of them sponsored by my company, some of them not. I've been coaching other leaders for 7 years. I've had great mentors along the way. I've gone to networking events and leadership summits. You have to build the skill intentionally. And if you don't want to be a great leader, then don't lead people. Be an IC, make a bunch of money, do your job, go home, log off at the end of the day. Do not put yourself in a position to be a leader and a people manager if you do not want to do it. It will only hurt you and your entire team. Welcome back to Secrets of a Corporate Game. So many people are trying to navigate a corporate world that is laden with secrets, cleverly hidden and unspoken rules to a game that most employees don't even know they're playing. On this podcast, we try to give you a peek behind the curtain and unveil some of those secrets with tips and tricks that you can apply today to start taking control of your career and progress up the ladder faster. Welcome back, all of my lovelies, to another great episode of Secrets of the Corporate Game. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you 10 lessons that I have learned over the course of my career that I wish somebody had told me sooner. They're going to be rapid fire. They are going to be deep and impactful in your career. And they are going to be the 10 things that I think make the biggest difference when it is time for you to really step into that future version of yourself and start to find the progression that you deserve. So we're going to jump right in. And today you're going to see me looking down because for once, I actually have notes of what it is that we're going to be talking about because these are 10 lessons I don't want to get wrong. And we're going to kind of build up. Number 10 is obviously going to be my favorite and one of the ones I think is the most important, but all of these are critical. So if you don't listen to a single other episode that I ever make, please listen to this one, 10 things that will change the trajectory of your career. So coming in spot number 10, and this should be no surprise for anybody who's listened to my podcast or followed me on social media for any period of time, is that you have to advocate for yourself. Okay. It's a big mistake that I see people make is they think, well, I'm just going to do a really great job. I'm going to work really hard and I'm going to get recognized for it. And that works really well in academia. And this is why so many of us believe this is because as we're growing up and we're in class, if we study and we do well, we get an A. And our teacher may give us a gold star, depending on your school, or you may get some type of recognition for having the highest GPA. You might be valedictorian. You might have all of these different things that go for you. So we think that by doing great work, we're going to get that recognition that we want. The reality is that once you get into corporate, it becomes way less about that. Now you still have to do your job, and we're going to talk about that more as we get through the 10 things, but it's not just about doing your job. You have to advocate for yourself. You have to make sure your leadership knows what you're doing, why it's important, what is the value to your team and your organization. And you have to be able to articulate that fairly frequently. And this kind of leads me to the second piece of this, which is going to be our number 9, which is your boss is not your only advocate. So a big mistake that I see people make when they start learning to advocate for themselves and they start to build up this skill is they focus really intently on their direct supervisor. And your direct supervisor definitely is a huge resource for you. They are going to go into meetings and advocate for you, or they should be if they're good bosses. But they're not the only people who have control over the trajectory of your career. If you've never listened to my podcast episode about cross calibrations, go check that episode out. We will link it in the show notes. But ultimately what happens when it comes time for performance reviews is your boss may go in and say they are great and they are going to advocate for you. And you've been advocating for yourself with your boss. And they go in that room and they say, here's all the great work that Kendall has done. And nobody else in that room knows about it or cares about it. It doesn't matter how great your boss thinks you are. You're not going to get that promotion. So you have to have a broader scope of advocacy. This means your boss's peers need to know the work you're doing and think it's great. Likely your skip level needs to know the work you're doing and think it's great. And this requires building broader self-advocacy. This is finding the right meetings to present to. A lot of the times when I'm working with clients, I'll call this your roadshow. Who are all of the different stakeholders or partner groups that you can interact with that by sharing with them what you're doing, you're going to create advocates out of them. You're going to get support from them. You're going to make their lives easier and give them a tool that they can use, right? building that broader support is really critical to that self-advocacy. So number 10, number 9 are you have to advocate for yourself, and you have to advocate for yourself more broadly than just your boss. They are not the only decision maker in your leadership team. And if you don't focus more broadly than them, you're going to get stuck. And that's where I see a lot of people come to me in my program. They say, hey, well, my boss has been promising me a promotion the last 2 cycles, but it's never happened. It may be that your boss is gaslighting you. Totally possible. Let's all be real here. We've all had those bosses. But it could be that your boss genuinely wants you to get promoted, but then they go into a room with their peers don't agree, and your boss does not have the skills to advocate for you beyond their own leadership team. So you have to take that onus on yourself. So these are 2 huge ones. We're starting off super strong today. Number 8 is don't be afraid to ask questions. And everybody says this. And if you're listening to this podcast episode and you're like, I'm going to turn it off. That's lame. It's stupid. This applies especially to my more senior individuals. When you are junior and you're just starting out and you're in a new role, I find most people find it's much more comfortable to ask questions because they're in a new industry, they're in a new role type, they have a new manager. So they can say, hey, obviously I'm new. I'd love to hear about this. But what happens when you get past your first 90 days? Or what happens when you're 15 years into your career and you still have questions? It gets increasingly less comfortable to step out of your zone of skill to ask somebody how to learn something new. And this is when it's most important. So the best executives that I've ever worked for ask a ton of questions. Explain to me why that works. Talk me through your methodology here. What's the thought process? What are the risks that we have? What are the pitfalls? They ask tons and tons and tons of questions. They actually very rarely even share their own opinion. They ask more questions. And through those questions, we all arrive at the same destination. I call this bringing somebody on your thought journey, right? It's really easy for us to say the answer is A. But how do we explain to somebody all of the thoughts we went through to get to the answer is A so that we can bring them with us on that thought process? So don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask stupid questions. I ask stupid questions all the time. Okay. And in asking questions, you're going to get to know your peers better. You're going to get to know your subject matter better. You're going to understand a situation better. You're going to avoid pitfalls more effectively. And this one's going to kind of segue with like a number 8.5, which is always be learning new skills and new tricks. Okay. The world is changing rapidly. Technology is changing rapidly. Progression is changing rapidly. And if you know one really great skill, I'm going to use Excel as an example. Okay. When I first started my career, Excel was like the it tool, which if you use Excel today, you're probably like, the it tool for what? Like VLOOKUPs? Yes, in fact, correct. Okay. This is aging me, and a few people that I knew still used Access databases. So if you're not familiar with Access is like a more powerful version of Excel that can handle more data, but it kind of got replaced by Excel over time. So more Excels were connecting directly to databases. They didn't need Access in the middle anymore. Okay. If you're not my age, none of this makes sense to you. Okay. So I learned a lot of Access when I was first in my career, and I worked on a project that required me to learn SQL. Now, if you're in any type of technology now, SQL is very commonplace. It's one of the first tools that you learn to use. But at the era where I was learning it, nobody used SQL. There was one person in my 20,000 person company who knew how to write it. One. And I sat in her cube every day for 6 months to learn it. Okay. This is before you could go on YouTube and be like, teach me how to write SQL, and you could teach yourself in a weekend, or before there were programs like Data Camp where you could go, do a certification program. Okay. You have to be willing to learn new things, and you have to be willing to be bad at those things in the short term so that you can get better at those things in the long term. And this goes back to asking questions, being curious, learning new things. It is incredibly rare that leadership brings me a project I've already solved. And I know that sounds, wrong, because we think, oh, these senior leaders in my company, they've done this for 20 years. They know how to do all of this. They have all of these answers. They know all of these things. And the reality is they don't. They may have solved similar problems. They may have used similar problem solving skills. They may have used similar technologies. They may have thought about similar solutions, but odds are they have not solved the exact niche that you're going after. Okay. It's really rare. And what makes you valuable as you progress in your career is your fungibility. So this is a term that was used a lot when I worked at Capital One. What was your fungible skill set? What skills did you have that were transferable? So I can solve problems for HR just as easily as I can solve problems for tech, just as easily as I can solve problems for marketing if I have the context and I'm able to apply the same problem solving skills, right? So think about, how do you ask questions to learn the right pieces of information, the right context, so that you can make the right decisions and drive your organization forward. Okay. Don't stop asking questions. Don't stop learning new things. Those are the people who I see plateau, right? And don't be afraid to ask somebody more senior than you a question or more junior than you. Doesn't matter. Okay. Like I said, I ask questions literally all the time. Okay. It's like a running joke. So this brings us to number 7. And this is actually part of my reputation and my personal brand. And so maybe it's just one that I feel really strongly about. So you're all going to do it now. You need to give other people credit. One of the biggest frustrations I have is when I work on a project for 6 months with somebody and then they present it and they get the credit and they get to talk to leadership and my name's not brought up once. I hate that. And it happens less and less the more senior you get, because you have a broader audience and you have more people that you're interacting with that are going to give you credit, et cetera. But it's really, really important that you are giving credit to other people when they help you. And so I'm going to give a quick anecdote. I present to my C-suite leadership fairly often in my current role, right? So for those of you who are new listeners, yes, I have a full-time job. Yes, I'm also a career coach and run all this on the side. No, I don't get enough sleep. Thank you for asking. Okay. But when I think about presenting to them, I start every presentation with, hey guys, before I jump in, I just really quickly want to give a shout out to so-and-so in finance. They've been a huge help in this project. Or I just want to mention that this team did a great job getting me the information that I needed, and none of what I'm presenting would be possible without them. I start every single presentation with who helped me. Now, sometimes those are people in my own team. Hey, I want to give a huge shout out to so-and-so in my team who built this. They've done a great job. This took a lot of effort. This was a lot of rigor in order to get this created. Sometimes I give that credit to my own team. But I always start a presentation with giving credit to other people. And so much so that it became a joke where I was presenting to my COO on a project. And before I even started talking, he goes, okay, it's time for shout outs. Kendall, who are we shouting out today? And I love that that's part of my reputation, because it builds trust with me, with my stakeholders and my peers. They know that if they help me, I'm going to mention their name. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you're finding the information on this podcast helpful and you're looking to take control of your career and start to elevate yourself to the next level, go ahead and check out our course. Go to bit.ly/career coach course to get signed up today and to start taking your career to the next level and navigate the secrets of the career game. They know that if I ask them for something, it's going to get recognition, that I'm not just going to sweep it under the rug. It allows me to work more effectively with my stakeholders. And my leadership knows that I'm not greedy for attention or for accolade or for credit. I'm willing to share that with the groups that I feel are doing great things that support me. And that showcases leadership, it showcases vision. It's a great partnership and collaboration skill. And so my advice to you is always to give credit where credit is deserved. Now, the place where I see people struggle with this the most is, yeah, but my peers don't do that to me. My peers take credit for my work. Why would I give them credit when they help me? That's not fair. Okay. So 1, be better. Just be better. Be better than them. Okay. We don't have to stoop to that level in order to get the accolade and the recognition that we deserve. Okay. Now, I will say there are times in my career where I've given credit to other people and they've taken that credit and it has stabbed me in the back. It happens. But I don't look back on those experiences and say, wow, I really wish I'd stolen the credit and I'd swept that under the rug and I'd hidden that. I don't think that makes me a good person. I don't think that makes me a good employee. I don't think that makes me a good leader. I think, wow, the leader who responded that way is shitty, right? Okay. So don't stoop to their level. But this also brings me to tip number 6, which is don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. Yeah. I think this is becoming more common. And I'm going to give a lot of this credit to Gen Z, honestly. There have been podcast episodes where I've talked about some of the nuances of Gen Z that I'm not a huge fan of. But one of the things that I think they do really well is they are willing to say what it is they believe they deserve. And they are willing to stand up for themselves in situations where, like, millennials and Gen Xers, like myself, like, we would never have. We would have just let it go. Right. And I've talked about it on this podcast before. When I was early on in my career, I had an executive say, I look like I should be dancing on the table instead of sitting at it. And I said nothing. Right. And even today, I don't know that I would say anything because I was just so shocked and so flabbergasted and couldn't believe this was like real life, right? So when you think about situations that are occurring, it is okay to stand up for yourself, but we want to do it in a way that doesn't alienate us from our peer group. Even if they deserve it, even if they're terrible, even if they steal credit for us all the time, how do we do it in a way that is still collaborative and still effective? So one of my favorite ways to do this is, say you worked on a project with somebody and then now they're presenting this to the broader group. Okay. And I had a client where this happened. Actually, she was working with an individual. He presented their project to the group and gave her 0 credit. Right. And it happened enough times that this was starting to become a pattern and we felt uncomfortable with it. So the way we chose to handle this situation is the next time when he was presenting, we said, hey, I'm so glad that you bring this up. After you and I were working on these slides, I had a thought and I was curious, how would we handle this situation? It's a subtle way to bring in like, hey, when we worked on these slides, when I made them with you and I was contributing, which you didn't mention, but that's fine. I was also thinking about this other situation that you have not touched on, right? Or, hey, when we were talking about this offline, I was thinking about it the other day and I meant to make a change to this slide, but I didn't get to it in time. I was thinking about this. It is a way of showcasing like, hey, I was involved. I'm not going to let you take credit for my work. I'm willing to speak up for what it is that I've contributed and to call out any flaws that I see or risks that I see. But we're doing it in a way that is for the betterment of the group. It's not, hey, you stole my slides, which is not productive and is just honestly not going to help us or help them or help anybody. It's more about, hey, I'm glad that you brought this topic up after you and I discussed it, after I helped you with this, after we made these slides, after you pinged me. When you do that, you take a little bit of that power back for yourself. Hey, it's not just them, it's me too, right? Now, the flip side of this is also you should be CYAing with your boss. If you don't know what CYA stands for, it is cover your $$sign. That's how I'm going to say that. Okay. For the record, I do curse. I just try not to on the podcast. Okay. But you should be covering yourself with individuals are these types of people. Something that we do proactively is, hey, I'm working on these slides with this individual. We say that to our boss. We let them know what we're doing. We let them know the impact. We let them know when it's going to be presented if we know that. And we give them the context. That way, when they see that slide, they see those presentations, they know that we contributed. Versus after it's been done, we say, oh, well, I helped with that. And they're like, oh, great, you helped with that, right? So CYAing is proactively informing your boss when you're working with individuals who have a tendency to take credit for your work. So that's one piece of it. The second piece is don't be afraid to speak up for yourself and call them out in a meeting in a productive way, right? The last thing is if they say, hey, I've been working on this for 6 months and they mention other people, but they leave you out, it's okay to raise your hand and say, hey, I'm glad to hear you give shout outs. I think these teams have been really instrumental. I also want to call out the role that my team has played in this as we've been supporting XYZ. Don't be afraid to do that. Don't do it frustrated. Don't do it emotional. Don't do it catty. But it is okay to take credit for the work that you've done, right? Which is another reason why the other rule is so important, which I think was 7, is make sure you're giving other people credit. Because if you're giving them credit, then they don't feel the need to do this to you. And if you're not getting the credit you deserve, then you implement number 6 and you take the credit and the power back, right? These are important things to do over the course of your career. Now, this shouldn't be a constant exercise. You shouldn't be walking into every meeting like, I did this. Nobody wants to be that person, right? But I have had clients come to me and they're like, well, I lost it in that meeting and I yelled at them. Like, we don't want to get to that point either. So measure yourself, have a script ready of like, hey, this is how I'm going to approach the situation when it occurs, and then take a little bit of that power back for yourself. So this brings us to number 5, which this one should not be a surprise at all, literally at all. If you've listened to any video or podcast or anything that I've ever made, you have control over your personal brand. A really common misconception that I see, a limiting belief that I see, is that people think that their reputation, their brand is something that happens to them. Well, my boss said I'm good at this. My boss said I'm bad at this. My peer said that I don't have a good reputation for doing this. And we think that this is something that happens to us and we just have to accept it. But that's not true. The reality is your personal brand is created by you in a combination of the words that you use and the actions that you take. So when it comes to creating your personal brand, you have to understand what you want to be known for. You have to understand what your unique skills are. You have to understand what you don't want to be known for. And you have to use that to create language that is consistent when you talk about yourself. I've used this example before, but if you ask anybody who's managed me in the last 15 years, they will almost always use the phrase black hole. Because when I talk about the work I do, I say, hey, I'm the person you put in the black hole that brings organization to chaos. And they hand me a new project and I go, great, another black hole for me to clean up. I use that term and then I follow through with it in my actions. I bring that organization, I bring structure, I add value. And so the way that my reputation is built is around, well, Kendall's the person you put in the place where you need organization, where there's a black hole, where nobody knows what's going on. You have control over that. You have control over that personal brand. And the stronger your personal brand is, the more effective your career progression, your career direction. The reason for this is we've all probably worked with somebody. If you take a second and you just reflect on like great people you've worked with, it's probably a short list, right? Probably not super long. Take a second. Boom. Okay. There's all three of them. Great. Think if you have more than like 10 people that you've worked with that you think are great, you've had a really awesome career and congratulations. I can think of probably close to 10. I've been pretty lucky, but if you're sitting there and you're like, there's only 2 people that come to mind, that's cool. It's pretty normal. All right. So say it's Susie. And when you think of Susie, you're like, wow, she is really great at this. And then if you look over all the times you interacted with her, she probably uses that phrase to describe herself. She probably did a lot of projects in that niche that did that skill. She probably displayed that skill really highly. And she probably built other people up to display that skill really well as well. And so when it comes to building your personal brand, she had control over all of those things. She doesn't have control over how I describe her necessarily, but she has a lot of control over how I perceive her, what type of work she does, what her value is. Those are important skills. And so when you think of your own career, building that personal brand is really, really important. And this brings us to number 4, which is you have to have a network. You do. I'm sorry. You have to have a network. Okay. This goes back to rule number 9, where you have to be advocating more broadly than your boss. That requires a network. This goes back to you have to have a personal brand. You have control over your personal brand. You have to have a network to share that personal brand with. Building relationships is strategic and necessary for your career. So a lot of people give building a network a really bad reputation. Well, it's manipulative. They're brown nosing. They're such a suck up. The reality is that if you do not build relationships with the right people who have the right amount of control over your career, and then you don't advocate and build your personal brand with those people, you will fail. Whether that's I fail in 1 year or I fail in 10 years, you will fail because at some level of leadership, your progression becomes about your ability to build relationships and not about your ability to do your technical skill set. So if you start networking early and you build a really robust network and you build all these relationships and you maintain them, then later in your career, your progression becomes easier. So I'll give an example. My first job out of college, I worked for a CFO, and I've shared the story before, but my direct report was a first-time manager, and his boss was a director coming from kind of a different niche than what we were working in. And I had a good relationship with my manager. We still keep in touch, but I had a really great relationship with my director and a really great relationship with my CFO. And I interacted with them on a daily basis. Okay. This role was 13 years ago now, 14 years ago now. It's been a long time since I held that role specifically. I still talk to them twice a year, still, because they're still executives. They still have really good relationships with me. I still think really highly of their skills and their business acumen. I've maintained that relationship for over a decade, and I've never worked for them since, and I may never work for them again. But I think they're genuinely good people, and I think they genuinely do good work. And maintaining those relationships sets me up for success, where if I were, heaven forbid, to lose my job and need a job, they would be my first call. And I haven't worked with them in over a decade. That is a network, right? The individuals that I worked with when I worked at Capital One, which is almost 10 years ago now, I still keep in touch with many of them. I still message many of them once or twice a year. I still keep in touch because I think really highly of them. I think they have great business acumen. I think I could work for them in the future, right? When you meet those individuals who you think strongly of, who you have a good relationship with, it's important to maintain those relationships. You don't have to maintain every relationship. You don't need a list of 100 people you're reaching out to every year. But I probably have a good 10 to 20 people that at least once a year, I'm like, hey, it's, congratulations. It seems like you're doing great work. Just want to reach out, see how you're doing. And it's not when I need a job, it's just in general. So that if and when I do need a job, it's not the first time they're hearing from me in 10 years. Right? This is maintaining and building that relationship and that network. It also means that with the exception of the job I'm in currently, actually, I've pretty much never cold applied for a job. I've always either been referred into or recruited by somebody I worked with or recruited by a leader that I knew for every single job. The job I'm in now, actually, in a very interesting turn of events, was a cold application and actually a LinkedIn easy apply of all things, and is like one of the best jobs I've ever had in my whole life. And I love my leadership team, but you have to have that network. You have to have those relationships. And now within my company, I have a huge network of people that I work with on a regular basis. And that becomes so important because that's going to allow you to grow and to progress. So rule number 2 or 3, right? 3, rule number 3. So it'd be great if I could count, which math majors really struggle with, in case you're curious. Rule number 3 is that great leadership is key. At certain levels of your progression, if you cannot lead people, you cannot be successful. Now, a company is almost never going to teach you how to be a great leader, right? I've referenced a Forbes article multiple times, says most managers do not receive training to manage people until 11 years after their first direct report. Not ideal. Okay. But say you work for one of those like golden companies that does give you training. Hey, we're going to have you managing people. We're sending you to this training. I've been to a lot of manager trainings. Odds are they're not teaching you very much. They're teaching how to give coaching feedback. Maybe you do some role plays with how do you give constructive feedback? How do you assign tasks? How do you involve accountability? But odds are they're not teaching you on the job how to be an effective manager. And what I see when I work with leaders is that people who want to be great leaders, they read books. They listen to podcasts like this. They get a coach. They have a mentor who's a great leader. They read about culture. And then they implement those things in their organization. And sometimes those things land really well and they work really great. Sometimes those things don't land and they don't work great. The first large team that I ever managed, I was not in a good place to manage them effectively, right? I look back now. At the time, I thought I was a great boss, right? I did one-on-ones. I had daily stand-ups. I talked to everybody. But I look back and I did not know how to add enough structure and enough direction for them to operate effectively. Now, they were a very high-performing team, which allowed us to still be successful. It's always easier to manage high-performing teams than low-performing teams. But I didn't know enough about management to ensure that our team operated effectively. Now I fast forward, I like to think I'm a much better leader. There are still areas where I struggle. There's still things I don't like doing. But that skill has improved so much. But I've read 50 books on the topic. I've gone to 10 different leadership trainings, some of them sponsored by my company, some of them not. I've been coaching other leaders for 7 years. I've had great mentors along the way. I've gone to networking events and leadership summits. You have to build the skill intentionally. And if you don't want to be a great leader, then don't lead people. Be an IC, make a bunch of money, do your job, go home, log off at the end of the day. Do not put yourself in a position to be a leader and a people manager if you do not want to do it. It will only hurt you and your entire team. Very passionate about this topic because I've worked for some really, really terrible leaders and I've worked for some really amazing ones. And the difference of how I felt about my job, how I felt about my career, how I felt about my progression is night and day when I worked for a great boss versus a terrible one. So you can become a great leader. It's not a natural skill. Nobody was birthed out of the womb wearing a 3-piece suit and ready to crush the boardroom and leadership skills. Okay. It is a learned skill. It is a flexed muscle, but you have to do it on purpose. You cannot do it on accident. Rule number 2. I feel like these should be the secrets of the corporate game, but they're not because those are going to be in my book that comes out next year. Okay. Rule number 2 is firing is sometimes necessary. Okay. I do not like firing people. Nobody likes firing. Well, I'm sure some people like firing people. That sounds awful. I hate firing people, but I will do it. And here's why. When you are a good leader, when you've hit rule number 3 and you move into 2, if you have given them a chance to improve, you've given them clear, constructive, measurable feedback, you've given them clear, measurable expectations, and they fail to have the right attitude, the right culture, or the right work ethic to deliver on those things, then they are not helping your team. And they need to be removed. There are lots of studies that show when you have a poor performer in a team, it actually makes the rest of your team work less, makes them more disgruntled with their experience and with their perception of their leader. It makes the team less happy. Like the general feelings of positivity in the workplace decrease when you have a negative employee. And generally, it just makes your life way harder because you can't give work to this person. So you have to spread it more evenly across your other people, which burns them out, makes you stressed. You have to constantly be giving feedback. Feedback's not well received. It is exhausting to manage somebody who does not want to help themselves. And in those situations, it is better to fire them and to let them go than it is to keep making you and your whole team miserable. Okay. Now, I want you to give them a chance. I want you to give them clear expectations. I want you to give them clear deadlines. I want you to give them a clear scope of work. All of those managerial and leadership skills need to be implemented first. But then if they're the wrong fit, you need to let them go. And the big thing that I see is leaders who are afraid to fire somebody, so they leave them and then they quit and they make it the next manager's problem. That's not cool. And when I absorbed the team that I'm managing now, there was a manager whose team ended up moving under my organization. I remember talking to him and he was like, yeah, this person's terrible. And I was like, if you know that, why are they here? And they were like, yeah, it's just really hard to hire somebody good in that role. And I was like, no, it's not. I could hire somebody tomorrow who's great in that role. Why would we keep somebody who's bad? And I gave them 6 months, managed them effectively, gave clear expectations. And I was like, yeah, this person is not going to be a good fit for my management style. And when I let them go, they go, yeah, that makes sense. I probably wasn't going to be the right fit for this. Like they knew just as much as I knew. Okay. And that doesn't mean that firing doesn't suck. It doesn't mean it's not a negative experience. It doesn't mean that nobody likes it. It's necessary. Right? Barbara Cochran gives an interview where she talks about how she loves firing people on Fridays because that one poison apple is poisoning her whole group. And that's true. I don't love it, but I do think that it hurts your team to keep somebody who's an underperformer. And this brings us to number one, right? And I told you number one is going to be my favorite. It's going to be the one that we talk about the most because I'm most excited about it. And these are things that I really think propel your career forward. Number one is your boss has no idea what you're doing. They also probably have no idea what they're doing, but they definitely have no idea what you're doing. This is important for a few reasons. One, going back to self-advocacy. If you don't talk about the work that you're doing, you assume my boss knows I'm doing this. No, they don't. No, they don't. And they're not paying attention. And even if they know you're working on it at a high level, they don't understand the effort, the impacts, none of it. Because your boss is too busy trying to do their job. They're not thinking about your job. All right. And I like to think I'm a pretty good leader. I like to think I keep a pretty close pulse on what's happening in my team. Every week, somebody will tell me something happened that I'm like, oh my God, I had no idea that happened. And they're like, yeah, we handled it. Every week. Because if you're running a high-performing autonomous team, there is no way that that manager knows everything that's going on. And if you have a bad manager or a disconnected manager or a non-engaged manager, they definitely don't know what you're doing. Okay? You have to be able to communicate to your boss what you're doing. The second reason that this is really important is because the broader organization also does not know what you're doing. Even if you tell them, even if you show them, even if you're sending weekly emails, they don't know. And so this is where it becomes really important to have those strong relationships that are going to allow you to show off your skills, your deliverables, the impact that you're having for the betterment of the company. Because they are too busy focusing on what they need to do to be focusing on you and what you're doing. Everybody. We all have blinders. Right? With very few exceptions, if I went up to anybody in my company and said, hey, what does this random person work on? Max, they could give me 1 or 2 sentences, but they probably couldn't tell me with any detail. Probably couldn't tell me any huge wins they've had this year so far. Probably couldn't tell me any big deliverables they've rolled out. And not through any fault of either of those individuals, but just because we all have blinders and we're focused on what we need to do first. We're focused on our priorities first, our needs first. And so this is important when it comes to advocating for yourself. It's important when it comes to building your network. And it's important when it comes to dealing with interpersonal conflict and interpersonal relationships in general, frankly. Because if I go to somebody and I need something and I say, hey, I need this data, and they don't respond. And 2 weeks go by and I follow up, but they still don't respond. Then I'm annoyed because they're not giving it to me. They are not disregarding me. Let's give them benefit of the doubt intentionally. But they have their own list of priorities they're focused on that they are putting higher than my requests. And honestly, depending on what they do, that might be the right call. The work they're doing might be more important than what I need. And so it's really important when we're interacting with other individuals, whether it's friction or non-friction, and we say, hey, I need this. Here's the value. Here's the impact. What do you think is a reasonable expectation for you to get that to me? And if they say, listen, I am completely swamped this week, the earliest I'm going to get it to you is Monday, we say, great, can I expect it by Monday, end of day? I understand you've got other things going on. Let me be flexible. And if what we're doing is a higher priority than what we're working on, we say, hey, listen, the CEO asked for this. I really need it by end of day at the absolute latest. But we have to have two-way communication. We have to understand what they're working on and what they're going through and what they're prioritizing, how it relates to what we need and what we're prioritizing. And then we have to have open communication. When we become two blinders on what we are trying to do, we lose that aspect of interpersonal relationship building. And that's where shit falls apart. So as a recap for people who made it through this whole episode, the 10 things that will propel your career forward. 10, you need to advocate for yourself. 9, your boss is not the only decision maker and you need to have relationships more broad that you're advocating to. 8, don't be afraid to ask questions, no matter how senior you are, no matter how smart you are. 7 is give other people credit when they help you. 6 is don't be afraid to take credit when you help other people. 5 is you control your personal brand. 4, you have to have a network. 3, great leadership is the key to long-term success. 2, firing people is sometimes necessary. And number 1, your boss has no idea what you're working on. And if you can take these 10 lessons that I've learned over the last 15 years in corporate, if you can start to apply them in your career, if you can start to really lean into improving in these spaces, I can guarantee you your career is going to propel forward and it's going to be much more successful and it's going to happen much more rapidly. I appreciate you guys tuning into today's episode. If you guys have any questions, please leave them below. If there are other things you've learned in corporate that you want to share with the group, make sure you put them in a comment and leave us 5 stars on this episode. Otherwise, we will be back next week with another great episode and we appreciate you checking in. I'm Kendall Berg, that career coach, and we'll be back.